This serial killer presentation is over Ray and Faye Copeland of Chillicothe, Missouri. They are known as the oldest couple ever sent to death row. They look pretty normal, like an average grandma and grandpa. Who was Ray Copeland, though? He was born in Oklahoma in 1914. His family moved around often until settling in Arkansas. He was a fourth-grade dropout. He started stealing to help his poor family. Being a fourth-grade dropout sounds bad in this day and age, but at the time, that was in the middle of the Depression, so that probably wasn't all that odd. In 1936, at age 21, he was arrested for check forgery and served a year in jail. In 1940, he was 25. He met his future wife, Faye. They were married after a 6-month courtship. Who was Faye Copeland? Well, she was born Faye Della Wilson. She married Ray in 1941 and gave birth to 4 sons and a daughter. They moved their little family around from California back to Arkansas. In 1949, Ray was arrested for cattle theft and did another year in jail. After his release from jail, they moved to Missouri for a fresh start. Things started to go bad there, so they moved to Illinois, and then they ended up back in Missouri. Everywhere they went, Ray was starting to be arrested for bad checks and livestock theft. This kind of kept the family on the move. Ray was described by neighbors and people that knew them as a tyrant and a control freak. He was violent against anyone close to him. The neighbors hated him, believing that he was verbally and physically abusive to his wife and the kids. Faye, being a conservative housewife, always stuck by her husband despite Ray's violent behavior and outbursts. Ray's first crimes. His scam was buying cattle at auctions, writing fraudulent checks, and then selling the cattle and trying to leave town before the auctioneers were informed that those checks were bad. If he failed to leave town in time, he had promised to make the checks good, but he would never follow through with it. Soon he was banned from buying livestock anywhere in the area. Copeland began hiring vagrants and drifters to work on his farm. These were people that had run away from home or trying to make their way in the world somehow, just looking for work. He set up checking accounts for them, gave them a little place to live, sent them to buy livestock with these bad checks, and then he would sell the livestock. The drifters would be fired and sent on their way. This kept the police off his back for a while, because remember, he was banned from buying livestock at these markets, so he would send these strangers in to do it for him. In time, he was caught and returned to jail. When he got out, he went back to the same scam because that's all he knew. This time, he made sure the hired help would never be caught or heard from again. In October of 1989, police received a tip that human bones could be found on farmland owned by an elderly couple, Ray and Faye Copeland. The man that reported them also claimed that they had tried to kill him, but he had escaped. Initially skeptical of those claims, police decided to investigate further. Armed with a search warrant and bloodhounds, the bodies of 3 men were found in a barn and 2 others in random places. They found a .22 caliber Marlin bolt-action rifle inside the home, which ballistics tests proved to be the same weapon as the one used in those murders. Each of those men had been shot in the back of the head. Ray and Faye were arrested on October 17, 1989. From the house, police also discovered the belongings of missing men and the notorious list of workers. The ones who had an X after their name were found dead, lying on the different locations on the farm. The most disturbing piece of evidence, other than the scattered bones and rifle, was a handmade quilt Faye had made out of the dead victim's clothing, which sounds very, very crazy, but remember, they grew up during the Depression, and in that time, they used whatever they could get a hold of. So if there was clothing laying around, people made quilts from it. The forensic examination concluded the handwriting on the paper belonged to Faye. She claimed knowing nothing about the murders, though, but Ray was illiterate and incapable of even writing a basic list of names. The known victims. The Copelands were quickly charged with 5 murders, identified as Paul Jason Cowart, John W. Freeman, Jimmy Dale Harvey, Wayne Warner, and Dennis Murphy. In the trial of the century, Faye went to trial in November of 1990. Her defense team claimed she was too also a victim of Ray and that she suffered from battered women syndrome. The jury didn't buy it and believed she knew very well that her husband was killing people. They also believed that she was participating by keeping the list and did nothing to stop him. However, the jury convicted her of 4 counts of murder and 1 count of manslaughter. She was given 4 death sentences for the murders and life without parole for the manslaughter. Upon hearing that Faye, his wife, had been sentenced to death, Ray showed no emotion and replied, "Well, those things happen to some, you know." Ray and Faye meet their end. In March of 1991, Ray went on trial. He first tried to plead for insanity, but quickly gave up and tried working out an agreement with authorities. The evidence was overwhelming against him, and he was charged with and convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Upon hearing that Faye had been sentenced to death, he also replied, "Well, those things happen to some, you know." Neither execution would take place. Ray died of natural causes October 19th, 1993, while waiting on death row. His body was cremated. What happened to Faye? Her attorneys appealed her conviction, contending that the jury had not been allowed to hear evidence that Ray had abused her for years. On August 6, 1999, a judge overturned the death sentence, but let the conviction stand, commuting her sentence to 5 consecutive terms of life without parole. Faye suffered a stroke in August of 2002 that left her partially paralyzed and unable to speak. She was paroled a couple of weeks later to a nursing home in Chillicothe. She died December 23, 2003 at the Morningside Center nursing home from what the Livingston County coroner, Scott Lindley, described as natural causes. What motivated them to kill? Probably because they were poor and didn't know any better. That seems like a very weak excuse, but it's probably the most likely answer. That's all they knew. They were motivated by money, which is not something completely unheard of in the serial killer realm. Could there be more bodies? Possibly. There's always been rumors floating around Livingston County in that area about barns, old barns, and what might you find in those barns. Could there be more bodies buried that we just don't know about yet? And finally, did they deserve their end? They were both tried and sentenced to death, but in the end, they only died of old age. So what you're going to find as you go through these serial killer presentations, many of these serial killers don't get a fair or fitting end, or what the jury decides should happen to them. They may be sentenced to life, they may be sentenced to death, and oftentimes it's just old age that gets them.